Imagine a machine of war, a 10-ton fortress of steel, thundering across the open ground. What's the fastest you think it could go? 30 miles per hour? 40? Maybe on a good day pushing 50? Now, what if I told you that in 1931, a tank was clocked at an astonishing 104 miles per hour? That's 167 kilometers per hour. Faster than most cars on the highway today. Faster than any tank that had come before it, and faster than almost any that would come after. A record that many believe still holds to this day. This wasn't a sleek, aerodynamic record breaker. This was a tracked, armored fighting vehicle. And it wasn't just a one-off fluke. The same design, on its wheels, could comfortably cruise at 70 miles per hour, leaving contemporary military vehicles in its dust. It was a machine so advanced, so radical, that it was said to be faster than a factory could even build it. A design so far ahead of its time, its own creator dubbed it the Model 1940 in 1928, convinced he was a full 12 years in the future. But the story of this impossible machine is even more incredible than its speed. It's the story of a man who was a brilliant engineer and a spectacular failure. A prickly, stubborn, and supremely self-confident inventor who clashed with the very military he tried to serve. A man whose revolutionary designs were rejected and ridiculed by his own country, only to be secretly sold to the Soviet Union, where they would give birth to the most legendary and influential tank of all time, the T-34. This is the story of the tank that won a war its creator never got to fight. It's the story of a forgotten American genius, a man who died in obscurity while his creation changed the course of World War II. This is the story of J. Walter Christie, the engineer who designed a tank faster than a factory could build it. So who was this man, this J. Walter Christie, who could conjure up a land battleship that moved with the speed of a race car? You might picture a buttoned-down elite engineer, the product of a top university, backed by a major corporation. You would be wrong. John Walter Christie was a classic American original, a self-taught, cantankerous, and visionary inventor who seemed to create success and failure in equal spectacular measure. His story begins not in a classroom, but in the grime and fire of the factory floor. At just 16, he was an apprentice machinist at New York's Delamater Iron Works, the very same company that had built the revolutionary engines and turret for the Union's ironclad, the USS Monitor, during the Civil War. From the start, Christie was surrounded by cutting-edge, history-making machinery. He was drawn to the biggest and most powerful technology of his day, naval guns. This led him to the shipyards of Philadelphia, where he made his first significant mark on the second battleship Maine. Convinced the Navy's design for the 12-inch gun turrets was too weak, he brazenly challenged the Naval Ordnance Department. The department grudgingly investigated, found he was right, and adopted his proposals. It was an early sign of a lifelong pattern. Christie, the outsider, believing he knew better than the establishment, and being proven correct. But as the 20th century dawned, a new machine captured his imagination, the automobile. And Christie didn't just want to build cars, he wanted to reinvent them. He was the first to combine a transverse or sideways-mounted engine with front-wheel drive and independent front suspension. It was a brilliantly compact and efficient layout that wouldn't be perfected and popularized for another half-century, with the iconic Mini in 1959. Walter Christie had the blueprint 50 years earlier. He poured this inventive spirit into a decade-long, gloriously unsuccessful racing career. His results were a masterclass in catastrophic failure. In 1905, he entered the prestigious Vanderbilt Cup, failed to qualify, but was allowed to race anyway. He promptly collided with the race leader, Italian automaker Vincenzo Lancia. A year later, he finished 13th out of 14 cars. His most audacious attempt was the 1907 French Grand Prix. He showed up in France with a home-built car, no pit crew, and no support to face the powerhouse factory teams of Europe. His car, which rarely ran 20 miles without breaking down, predictably fell apart. Yet, with supreme confidence, Christie later claimed that when it was running, not a single competitor passed him. His racing career ended, fittingly, in a crash that saw him carted off to the hospital, while his nephew, who had been thrown from the car with him, reportedly lay on the track laughing uncontrollably. Racing was a costly distraction, and his automotive companies collapsed one after another. One investor successfully sued him for mismanagement, winning a massive judgment. He designed a brilliantly advanced taxi, but it was so expensive he only ever built one. Then, in 1912, Christie finally struck gold. He invented a rugged, two-wheeled tractor that could be attached to the front of horse-drawn fire engines, instantly motorizing them. For the first time, he was a commercial success, selling hundreds to fire departments across the country and making substantial money. This was his chance to become a conventional, wealthy businessman. But Christie was not an attentive businessman. He was an easily distracted inventor. He took the money, and instead of perfecting his one profitable product, he poured it all back into his first love: big guns and the dream of making them mobile. This was the essential contradiction of J. Walter Christie. He was a man of undeniable genius, but he was also his own worst enemy. He was described as prickly, stubborn, and having histrionic inclinations. Even his greatest supporters, like General George S. Patton, admitted he was difficult. Yet Patton also saw the brilliance, writing after meeting him that Christie was designing what I think will be the greatest machine in the world. It was this volatile mix of visionary engineering and a personality that refused to compromise that would define his next and most important chapter: his war with the United States Army. After a decade of scattered success and spectacular failure, Walter Christie turned his full attention to the problem that would define his legacy: the tank. He had a vision, one that was radically different from the slow, trench-crawling behemoths of World War I. He believed the future of warfare lay in speed, in lightning-fast armored forces that could punch through enemy lines and wreak havoc on their rear-echelon infrastructure and logistics. To do that, he needed a new kind of machine. After 5 years of relentless work and spending over $382,000 of his own money, an astronomical sum at the time, he produced his masterpiece, the M1928 prototype. Christie himself was so proud, so utterly convinced of its futuristic design, that he informally nicknamed it the Model 1940. He believed he had built a machine that was a full 12 years ahead of its time, and he was not wrong. The heart of this new machine was its revolutionary suspension system. Tanks of the era used stiff, primitive leaf springs that offered very little vertical movement, resulting in a bone-jarring ride that limited cross-country speeds to a crawl. Christie's solution was pure genius. He developed a helicoil suspension, where each of the tank's large road wheels was attached to a bell crank that pivoted, converting the vertical shock of hitting a bump into horizontal motion. This motion compressed a large, powerful coil, spring-housed inside the tank's hull. The result was a massive increase in suspension travel, up to 11 inches of vertical movement for each wheel. This allowed the tank to seemingly float over rough terrain at speeds that were previously unimaginable. But the suspension was only part of the magic. Christie's second key innovation was the convertible drive system. The M1928 had no smaller return rollers for the top of the track. Instead, the track was supported by the large road wheels themselves. This meant the tracks could be completely removed by the crew in about 15 minutes. On its tracks, the M1928 could reach a then impressive 42 miles per hour. But on a road, running only on its large, rubber-rimmed wheels, it could achieve a staggering 70 miles per hour. For context, a modern M1 Abrams main battle tank tops out at around 45 miles per hour. Christie's machine was faster than a luxury passenger car of its era. Christie was also a pioneer in armor design. While his critics would later point to his tank's thin armor, he compensated for this with another feature far ahead of its time: sloped armor. The front of the M1928's hull was angled sharply backwards. This simple geometric trick dramatically increased the effective thickness of the armor plate and, more importantly, gave it a much higher chance of deflecting an incoming shell, rather than absorbing its full impact. It was a concept that would become a standard, life-saving feature on almost every successful tank design of World War II, most notably the German Panther and the Soviet T-34. In October 1928, Christie brought his creation to Fort Myer, Virginia, for a demonstration in front of the Army's top brass. The audience, including the Army Chief of Staff, General Charles P. Summerall, was stunned. They watched as the 10-ton machine roared across the testing grounds, climbing obstacles and hitting speeds that no one had ever seen from a tracked vehicle. General Summerall was deeply impressed and strongly recommended that the Infantry Tank Board conduct official tests immediately. Christie must have felt a sense of triumph. He had built his revolutionary machine, he had shown it to the right people, and they were amazed. His moment, it seemed, had finally arrived. But what Christie would soon discover was that in the world of military procurement, being a genius wasn't enough. You also had to play the game. And Walter Christie never played by anyone's rules but his own. The demonstration at Fort Myer should have been J. Walter Christie's crowning achievement. The Army's highest-ranking officer was impressed, and the machine's performance spoke for itself. But the M1928 was then handed over for evaluation to the Infantry Tank Board, a committee of mid-level officers who would decide its fate. And the Tank Board was not impressed. In fact, they were horrified. Their first and most glaring criticism was the armor. It was, in their view, dangerously thin, incapable of stopping even a round from a basic anti-tank rifle. For them, a tank's primary purpose was to survive on a chaotic battlefield, to absorb punishment while protecting the infantry. Christie's lightweight speed demon, with its paper-thin hide, seemed suicidal. But this disagreement over armor thickness was just the symptom of a much deeper, more fundamental clash of philosophies. It was a battle over the very soul of what a tank was supposed to be. The members of the Tank Board were men whose military minds had been forged in the crucible of World War I. They saw tanks as they had been used in that conflict, as slow, heavily armored battering rams designed to support infantry assaults, crush barbed wire, and reduce enemy strongpoints. For them, the holy trinity of tank design was armor and firepower. Mobility was a distant third. Christie, the civilian inventor, the man who had never served a day in the military, saw the future completely differently. He was a prophet of a new kind of warfare. He envisioned fast-moving, independent armored divisions that would operate like a modern-day cavalry. His tanks weren't meant to crawl alongside foot soldiers. They were meant to be unleashed. He advocated for lightweight tanks with long range and high speed, designed to punch a hole in the enemy's front line, bypass their strongpoints entirely, and then race deep into the rear to attack their command centers, supply depots, and communication lines. It was a revolutionary doctrine we would later come to know as blitzkrieg. In the late 1920s, the U.S. Army's Tank Board considered it heresy. They saw Christie's machine not as a breakthrough, but as a reckless and impractical toy. And Christie, in his typical fashion, did absolutely nothing to help his own cause. He was abrasive, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own genius. He treated the board's legitimate concerns with contempt. When they asked for modifications, he stubbornly refused, believing that he, the inventor, knew what the Army needed far better than the Army itself. This culminated in his now infamous response to a 1933 request for a new design, where he stiffly replied that the Army's specifications did not conform to the advanced art, and that his company could not and does not desire to comply. He was, in essence, telling the US Army that they were too ignorant to understand his work. It's not that he didn't have powerful supporters. Some of the most forward-thinking minds in the military recognized his genius. A young major named Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the potential, noting that Christie was designing a model we thought had many advantages. And Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton, a fiery cavalryman who shared Christie's belief in speed and shock action, was his most ardent champion. Patton was one of the few who could handle Christie's histrionic inclinations. After witnessing the inventor's work, Patton wrote ecstatically that it was the greatest machine in the world, as far ahead of the old tanks as day is from night. But it wasn't enough. The support of a few visionary officers couldn't overcome the institutional inertia and bureaucratic resistance of the Ordnance Department. The tank board passed the M1920 to the cavalry, who were more interested in its speed, but ultimately, the final decision came down from the top. The Secretary of War officially rejected the mass production of Christie's design, citing its thin armor, mechanical unreliability, and, most damningly, its excessive cost. The Army would instead continue to tinker with its own slow, heavy, and ultimately mediocre designs. For Christie, it was the ultimate betrayal. He had offered the US military a war-winning weapon, a machine 12 years ahead of its time, and they had rejected it. They had called his masterpiece too expensive, too flimsy, too radical. Embittered and nearly broke, Christie felt he had been released from any patriotic obligation. If his own country wouldn't buy his invention, he would sell it to the highest bidder. And there were interested parties waiting in the wings, nations who understood that the next war would be won not by the heaviest armor, but by the fastest tank. J. Walter Christie, rejected by his own country, was now a free agent with the most advanced tank design on Earth. And the world was taking notice. While the US Army was content with its slow, heavy prototypes, other nations were desperately seeking a technological edge. The political climate was tense, the world was a powder keg, and every major power was looking for the spark that would give them an advantage in the next inevitable war. As early as 1929, a Soviet delegation, led by the astute and powerful head of the Red Army's Motorization and Mechanization Department, Innokenty Kalepsky, was on a tour of European and American factories. Their mission was simple: find and acquire the best military technology the West had to offer. When they met Walter Christie, they knew they had found something special. They saw past the thin armor and the mechanical quirks. They saw what the US Tank Board had missed: the revolutionary potential of speed. Christie's doctrine of high-speed, deep-penetration warfare aligned perfectly with the Soviet Union's own emerging military theory of deep battle. The Soviets, with their vast open spaces and a command structure filled with former cavalry officers, understood the value of speed and operational maneuver. Christie's design wasn't just a tank, it was the key to unlocking their entire strategic vision. They were particularly fascinated by his unique lever-based suspension, which allowed for unprecedented cross-country performance in a compact chassis. Competition was fierce. The newly independent nation of Poland, seeing the rising threat from its Soviet neighbor, was also in negotiations with Christie to purchase his design. A Polish commission signed a contract in March 1930. But Christie, in a move that was either a shrewd negotiation tactic or another example of his chaotic business practices, failed to deliver. The deal collapsed, and Poland was left empty-handed. For the Soviets, the window of opportunity was wide open. The deal that followed was a masterclass in clandestine operations worthy of a spy novel. In 1930, the United States and the Soviet Union had no formal diplomatic relations. Direct sales of military hardware were strictly illegal. To circumvent this, the entire transaction was handled by the Amtorg Trading Corporation, a New York-based front company established by the Soviet government to procure foreign technology. Behind the scenes, Soviet OGPU agents were at work, and they had even managed to secure some of Christie's plans through a covert relationship with a sympathetic American Army officer. Christie, for his part, entered into a verbal gentleman's agreement with Kalepsky. On April 28, 1930, his company officially agreed to sell Amtorg two of his latest M1931 models. The price was $60,000 for the two chassis, plus $4,000 for spare parts. But the real prize for the Soviets was the final part of the deal, for which they paid an additional $100,000, a 10-year license for the full rights to produce, sell, and use Christie's design within the borders of the USSR. For a total of $164,000, the Soviets didn't just buy two tanks, they bought the future of their armored forces. Getting the tanks out of the country required one final audacious deception. The two chassis were shipped without their turrets. The official customs documents were falsified. These two marvels of military engineering, the fastest tanks in the world, were listed for export as common agricultural farm tractors. To complete the ruse, other crucial components were shipped separately in crates, brazenly marked as grapefruit. The U.S. authorities, either fooled by the deception or perhaps willing to look the other way, let the shipment pass. Christie's genius, rejected by the Pentagon, was now crated up and sailing for the Soviet Union. When the tractors arrived, Soviet engineers swarmed over them, studying every bolt and weld. They put the machines through a grueling 10-day, 150-kilometer trial. The results confirmed everything they had hoped for and everything they had feared. On wheels, the tank hit the promised 70 kilometers per hour, an unheard-of speed that left the Soviet testers in awe. But the trials also revealed a host of flaws. The suspension, while brilliant in concept, was fragile and prone to breaking. The engine overheated. The steering was so difficult that it physically exhausted the driver after just a few hours. Control deteriorated dangerously at top speed. The final report from the test commission was a perfect summary of the situation. The Christie tank, they wrote, was a highly interesting machine with universal movement, but it required extensive development as a fighting machine and the introduction of a number of design improvements and changes. The potential was immense, but the raw design was not yet a battle-ready weapon. The Soviets had bought a diamond in the rough. Now, the engineers of the Kharkov factory had the job of cutting and polishing it into the jewel of the Red Army. With Christie's prototypes in their possession, the engineers at the massive Kharkov locomotive factory, one of the largest industrial complexes in the Soviet Union, began the monumental task of transforming the Americans' brilliant but flawed design into a true fighting machine. They adopted the prototype for production, giving it a new designation: BT for Bystrokodny tank, or fast tank. The first models, the BT-2 and BT-5, were largely faithful to Christie's original vision. They retained the convertible drive, allowing them to switch between tracks and wheels, and their incredible speed was their defining feature. They were, in essence, cavalry tanks, designed for rapid breakthroughs and flanking maneuvers, perfectly embodying the Soviet deep battle doctrine. But the engineers in Kharkov were not idle. With each new iteration, they systematically addressed the weaknesses they had identified in the original design. They strengthened the fragile suspension, improved the engine's cooling system, and worked to make the controls more reliable and less exhausting for the driver. They also added a simple but effective turret, initially armed with a 37mm gun, which was soon upgraded to a much more powerful 45mm cannon. Throughout the 1930s, the BT tanks became a cornerstone of the Red Army's growing armored forces. Thousands were produced, and they served as a crucial training ground for a new generation of Soviet tank commanders and tacticians who learned to master the art of high-speed, mobile warfare. But the BT series had an Achilles heel, one inherited directly from Christie. Its armor was simply too thin for the brutal realities of the modern battlefield. The Spanish Civil War and border clashes with the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol in 1939 provided a deadly lesson. The BT tanks, while fast, were highly vulnerable to anti-tank guns. A new design was needed, one that could combine the Christie's revolutionary mobility with the armor and firepower necessary to survive and dominate. The result was the T-34. It was not just an upgrade, it was a quantum leap, arguably the most influential and effective tank design of the Second World War. The design team at Kharkov, led by the brilliant engineer Mikhail Koshkin, made a series of critical decisions. First, they abandoned Christie's convertible drive. They recognized that the ability to run on wheels was an unnecessary complication that added weight and complexity. By committing to a tracks-only design, they could simplify the tank and, more importantly, add more armor. And the armor they added was revolutionary. They took Christie's concept of sloped armor and applied it to the entire tank. The T-34's thick, welded plates were angled at up to 60 degrees, creating a shell-deflecting geometry that made it incredibly resilient. Early in the war, German anti-tank guns and the cannons on their Panzer III and IV tanks were often completely ineffective against it. Shells would simply ricochet off the T-34's sloped glacis plate. They combined this incredible survivability with a powerful 76.2mm main gun, which could tear through the armor of most German tanks at the time. And crucially, they did all this without sacrificing the core of Christie's genius: mobility. The T-34 was powered by a new, robust V2 diesel engine and retained the Christie suspension, giving it the same superb cross-country speed and agility that had defined the BT series. It was the perfect synthesis: the speed of a cruiser, the armor of a heavy tank, and the firepower to dominate the battlefield. When the T-34 first appeared in large numbers following the German invasion in 1941, it caused a state of shock among the Wehrmacht. German soldiers, who had swept across Europe with ease, suddenly faced a tank that was superior to their own in almost every respect. It was so effective, so influential, that it forced Germany into a desperate arms race, leading to the development of the much heavier and more complex Panther and Tiger tanks. From its introduction until the end of the war, the Soviet Union produced over 57,000 T-34s and more than 84,000 when including all variants. It was the most produced tank of World War II, a war-winning weapon that formed the backbone of the Red Army's charge to Berlin. And at the heart of every single one of them, in the DNA of its revolutionary suspension, was the ghost of the prickly American inventor who had sold them the idea for a handful of dollars. As thousands upon thousands of T-34 tanks, the direct descendants of his own creation, rolled across the battlefields of Eastern Europe, turning the tide of the Second World War, where was J. Walter Christie? Was he celebrated? Was he advising the U.S. War Department, finally recognized as the visionary he always claimed to be? No. On January 11, 1944, as the Red Army was preparing the massive offensives that would shatter the German front, J. Walter Christie died at his home in Falls Church, Virginia. He was 78 years old. He died in relative obscurity and near poverty, his life's work seemingly a string of frustrating rejections and missed opportunities. He never lived to see the full, world-altering impact of his invention. He never knew that the agricultural tractors he had sold to the Soviets a decade earlier had spawned the most important and influential tank of the entire war. He died while his own country was building tens of thousands of M4 Sherman tanks. Reliable, effective tanks, to be sure, but by no means the revolutionary leap in design that Christie had offered them years before. The irony is staggering, and it is the central tragedy of Christie's life. He was an American patriot, a man who had worked on the USS Monitor and the battleship Maine, who had desperately wanted to equip the U.S. Army with the best fighting vehicle in the world. The Army rejected him, citing cost, complexity, and a doctrine they refused to abandon. So Christie, embittered, sold his design to the Communists for what amounted to pocket change in the grand scheme of military budgets. And in doing so, he inadvertently gave the Allied cause one of its most crucial tools for defeating Nazi Germany. Without the T-34, with its Christie-derived mobility, it is hard to say if the Soviet Union could have survived the initial onslaught of Operation Barbarossa, let alone push the Wehrmacht all the way back to Berlin. The T-34's ability to keep moving and fighting in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, the mud, the snow, the vast distances, was a direct legacy of the suspension system born in a New Jersey workshop. The United States, in its fight against the Axis, found its most powerful ally equipped with a war-winning weapon that it had itself refused to build. Christie's rejected design, in the hands of the Soviets, played an indispensable role in winning a war that he never got to fight. His legacy, however, is not just the T-34. The British, who had also purchased a Christie prototype, smuggling it out of the US, dismantled in crates marked grapefruit, used his principles to develop their own successful series of fast cruiser tanks, like the Crusader, the Cromwell, and the Comet. The Christie suspension became the global standard for high-speed tracked vehicles for decades. The story of J. Walter Christie is a timeless lesson in the clash between visionary genius and institutional bureaucracy. He was a man who was, as he claimed, a decade ahead of his time. He saw the future of warfare with perfect clarity, but lacked the temperament and political skill to make the establishment see it too. He was a brilliant engineer, but a terrible salesman, a spectacular inventor, but a failed businessman. He was a prickly, difficult man who made enemies as easily as he made groundbreaking machines. In the end, history proved him right. Speed and mobility, not just heavy armor, did come to define modern armored warfare. His sloped armor and high-speed suspension became fundamental principles of tank design. He may have died in obscurity, but his ghost lives on in the DNA of almost every tank that followed. He is the forgotten father of the modern tank, the American genius whose greatest triumph was the victory he never saw. The engineer who truly did design a tank faster than a factory could build it, and more powerful than his own country could imagine.